the red button, so we're now recording. Thank you for the reminder, Chris.
All right, well, I'll get started then. How about that? Well, good evening or afternoon, depending on your perspective this afternoon. We appreciate you taking some time and spending it here with the city as we dive back into the draft growth policy or the Bozeman Community Plan. My name is Tom Rogers. I'm here with my colleague, Mr. Chris Saunders. We're from the Community Development Department. We've got a kind of a I wouldn't say lengthy, but a lot of material to cover based on the previous two discussions that we had with people who are interested of the public here based on the text of the draft plan and the future land use. We've called some of the questions and the comments and what seems to, or at least may have been missed a little bit during the last two presentations to try to bring that back before you. And as a result, it really is kind of a little bit of everything. So there's quite a bit of visuals that we have here that we can go back and refer to if necessary, but it's really intended to provide sort of an illustration of the text and the future land use and future land use map that are contained in the draft plan. So we'll dive into this. We have a presentation for you. Try to tee up some concepts and ideas and hopefully get some questions from you. So our summary of the plan will try to be succinct and to the point to give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have or give us something to work on before we take the draft plan to the next stage or the next level of review. So with that kind of background here, the community plan is what is it? It's a long-range planning document that really guides future land use. It provides a great deal of direction for the city commission to make decisions on how to implement what the community desires. That's through roads and water, sewer systems, transportation, and all of these pieces that make up our community. And it is a requirement. The state legislature does require each city to create and evaluate their community plan. Our last plan was, as noted here on the slide, was adopted in 2009. So it's been about 10 years. And we are here to generate this new vision for the community and bring it back before you for final kind of consideration. So, you know, why do we do this? It takes a lot of effort, a lot of communication, a lot of meetings with the staff, all the interested people, interested parties, groups. Is really important. As you haven't noticed, the community continues to grow, and there's a very long, kind of strong ethos of creating a resilient and sustainable community, trying to preserve these areas that really make Bozeman unique. Maintaining these community character areas, you know, through our historic preservation programs, development of the distal parts of the community. And one thing that we often strive and come back to is really the fiscal responsibility. We want to make sure that the cost of community services are covered through the development of the community, and we're not putting ourselves in a place where it might be fiscally impossible to maintain this quality of life that we have developed. So the plan or the development of this draft plan has been going on for nearly 2.5 years. So we divided it into 4 different components, each one very discrete pieces to develop and generate the plan that you see before us. And we are really in this last phase of phase 4, which is the review of the draft plan. So we're here for this evening. And then make any final changes, bringing that back to the City Commission for consideration and possible adoption. So with that in mind, we have today's, of course, the 30th of September. It's almost October. We've got 3 scheduled meetings coming in the next month here, 2 months. The next one will be Tuesday, October 6th. we bring this plan to the City Commission for kind of specific questions and comments and get some more direction from them. On the 20th, we'll bring it back for another work session and public meeting or public hearing with the City Commission. And then we do have the 24th of November scheduled to initiate possible adoption for the draft plan. So we really are kind of at the last stages of this. So it's really critical of your participation. Make sure that we heard what you said earlier through these earlier phases of the development of the plan. And then we still have a chance to make some final revisions based on comments that we received from you, the public.
So when Chris Saunders, thank you for attending tonight. Whenever the city does planning, it's not in a vacuum. There's always a context about which we're looking, both for the learning from the past and thinking about the future. So if we think about what's happened over the last 50 years, what we've seen is an almost continuous population increase, slight dip there in the mid-1980s. Even during the Great Recession about a decade ago, the city still continued to gain population. Next. So if we look at the entire history of the city, that is a trend that has been going forward for many years. Why don't you hit one more time there? There we go. So that first red line there was the first time the city adopted a community plan back in 1958. Each of the little stars is representing one of the other plans that we have worked on. Obviously at the top end there is today's efforts. But as you can see, even through all kinds of changes and development throughout the community, growth in the population has continued. So we believe in looking to the future that that's likely to continue. All of the exterior and interior forces that we see acting on the city indicate that that's likely to be the case. Next. But when we look at the context for planning, it's not just population trends and things like that. It's also our geography. We have neighbors, City of Belgrade, Four Corners area that's unincorporated yet. There is growth happening nearby and far away from Bozeman, and those influences affect us, and we take that into account as well. And it becomes an important part of the conversation. Recently, the City of Bozeman, City of Belgrade, and Gallatin County completed what's called the Triangle Community Plan, which was a cooperative effort between the three jurisdictions, looking at some common policy about what happens in that area, largely bounded by the Four Corners, Bozeman, Belgrade triangle, and how the three jurisdictions may work together. So that is a process that we take very seriously, not just looking interior to the city, but also how we interact with our neighbors.
So what is in the plan? Plan content. So it is divided into 5 chapters and then a group of appendices, which is we purposely separated into a second document to make it a little more kind of approachable, if you will, some more digestible in pieces. Chapter 1, as it says, are kind of the foundational pieces of like what is important and how we develop the plan. Chapter 2 is a critical piece. It describes our themes. There are 7 themes that are within the plan, and they really kind of capture the overall vision of what we heard the community say through our planning processes. And what's really interesting is we analyzed these themes compared to the last few adopted growth policies or community plans, which cover really more than 20 years, and they're surprisingly consistent, which is really good. Our community keeps telling us that they value the same things. Chapter 3 dives into this future land use and future land use map. That really indicates what kind of character you might see in the future as the city slowly grows and expands. Chapter 4 speaks to the implementation. How will we achieve the goals and the themes that are contained in the document with measures of success? Chapter 5, as noted, is sort of how do you amend this? How do you make changes? How does zoning work? And that type of content. This plan is a little bit different than you've seen the last that you've ever seen for community plan for the city of Bozeman, because it's very focused on land use and land use alone, and that was purposeful from the review and the development of this plan from the City of Bozeman Planning Board. They were very kind of future orientated, looking at encouraging and developing more mixed uses to encourage these diversity of uses, allows people to meet more of their daily needs closer, which is really furthers all sorts of other community plans that the city's adopted for infrastructure, transportation, climate action, sustainability and resiliency, and more. So the 7 themes, I've got them up on the screen here. We're not going to dive into each one individually. I just encourage you to read through these. It's actually pretty short, very direct. It really kind of dives right into what the content, what the meaning of these themes are. So the one question that we do get frequently and through the development of the plan and then over the last 2 meetings are, how does the community plan relate to all of the other plans that have been adopted by the city? So first is the city commission went through a very extensive program and developed what's called the strategic plan. It was adopted a couple of years ago, and one of the 7 focuses does state a well-planned city. And through that, the community plan just furthers that statement by organizing kind of in a very holistic manner how the community develops our economy. Of course, housing is a critical issue. We do have a community housing action plan. The other pieces of that, we have to deal with our natural environment, make sure that we have a clean and secure land to live on. We are stewards of that, and we certainly believe that, and this plan furthers that. In addition to that, simply the infrastructure, which is really one of the single largest expenditures of the city, is water, sewer, transportation, and the associated pieces of that through the capital improvements program. On page 9 of the plan, of the draft community plan, which means it's right up front, is a full list of the related plans in the community plan. Excuse me. There are 24 that are listed right here with an analysis little chart of how it relates to the strategic plan and each of these plans underneath here. So what's important to note here is in the appendix B, we've included a short summary of each one, the purpose and intent of each one of these plans and what they do, and a hyperlink. So it's very easy to gather. If you're interested in a particular subject matter, you can dive into this quite quickly. We are aware that during the publishing of the draft plan on the website, a couple of these links were severed or broken. They've been repaired, so it's all functioning correctly. So it's a really good resource to dive in a little bit further. Next, I'm going to jump into this is an illustration that we have in the plan that shows how the building blocks of our community, and it really starts at the base. The foundation of all this is based on the growth policy, and the future land use sort of indicates of what kind of character would happen in a particular area. And the text of the plan further details of what those colors on the map mean. For community commercial, which are very large scale buildings, we do need those types of services to smaller neighborhood services and goods and services to residential. We differentiate between kind of lower density and then higher density areas. And of course, the central core, the central business district, the City of Bozeman, which is also a historic district here in Bozeman. The next level is the zoning. It's more refined, it's more specific, but it's based on the future land use map. So certain zoning districts are encouraged or implementing districts, and others are not for a given future land use designation. Finally, where it really gets more technical and complicated is the subdivision and site plan. That's sort of the third dimension. It's like, where do the streets go? water sewer lines, where are the parks, open space, where do the buildings go, how the parking relates to pedestrian access, circulation, and what is the character of the buildings themselves, and how do they relate to neighboring properties. So, for example, this is in chapter 2. This is the 5th theme. It's a city that prioritizes accessibility and mobility. Underneath that, there's the important statement and then kind of a description of what that really means. That's followed by a series of goals and objectives. Each theme has some clear indicators of how that will happen. And then later in chapter 4, we actually develop measures of success. So you can follow and kind of pass through this context throughout the entire plan. Then from here, I guess go into the chapter 3, and I'll pass that to my colleague, Mr. Saunders, here to continue on.
Thank you. So chapter 3 looks at the future land use designations and map. The designations are the text descriptions that give more detail. The map broadly lays out geographically where different activities are expected to occur in the community. As part of the plan update this time, the planning board looked at the existing designations from the 2009 plan and chose to consolidate or rename or remove some of those designations. And so we've gone from 12 to 9. In some cases, name changes were comparatively minor and made little difference to the description of the use. In some cases, that name change was also paired with some material modifications. The designation on the future land use map, again, this is a change for this document, does encompass the entire planning area. It's roughly 70 square miles around the city. And it looks at the very long term. What is it that 50, 100 years from now, the city considers appropriate to be in a given area? It's not trying to predict how fast that map will be built out. There's too many factors involved that affect that. But the planning board did call, as part of this plan, for some more assertive implementation of the future land use map. And we'll talk about that in a bit. You go down, please, Tom. So when the future land use map was being developed, one of the things, oops, there we go. One of the things we looked at was what is already out on the ground. And this map, unfortunately, is a little fuzzy at this scale, but the area shown in white is the existing city limits. We looked at the land outside of it, and as you can see, a lot of that property is in a color. What that means is that property has been subdivided at some point. Could you go down to the next level, please? So on that map, there are nearly 4,000 parcels that are under 5 acres. That's about 92% of all of the property within the city's planning area is less than a 20-acre sized parcel. And so there's already been very significant amounts of development, whether that's suburban or rural, that's happened within the planning area. There are some large areas which are still open, but those factors were taken into consideration as part and parcel of the planning effort. Next, please. So the future land use map is shown on the screen. As I mentioned, it's not limited to the 20-year planning cycle for the growth policy. We do not expect this to fill in the next 20 years. The uses depicted there in the various colors are fairly broad. The kind of tannish color that you see is called urban neighborhood, and we'll talk about that in just a minute in some detail, but you can see that it's pretty broadly distributed throughout. One of the questions we've had through this process is the little orange dots that you see scattered throughout the planning area. Those are commercial pockets adjacent to mixed use areas. Those are located at major intersections of future or existing roadways. so that as the property in the planning area develops, there's an opportunity for people to have services within close proximity to their home, lessen vehicle travel, and create a sense of place. Next, please. So the future land use map has several different purposes. One is it does help the city commission in making decisions about zoning. Zoning is required to be in accordance with the growth policy. And so the growth policy, although it is not zoning itself, does affect zoning. The map does depict the city's expectations and enables us to encourage and support coordination with other agencies like the Triangle Community Plan that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Next. So also what the plan does not do. The future land use map does not change any existing zoning. Zoning is a legally separate process. It requires its own public processes, notices, decision processes, etc. Same thing with annexation. The future land use map does not depict or require anybody to join the city if they don't want to. That is, again, a separate legal process. And the future land use map does not require anyone to develop their property, whether they're in the city or not. This is an authorizing document. It says you can do these things and supports those depicted activities. But if you as the landowner choose to leave your property as is, you are absolutely welcome and entitled to do so. Next, please. So this is an example of the urban neighborhood description. You see the little color swatch there on the left. That's to help you identify that on the map. The title is the most summary possible description of what it is. The text gives a further description of what should be expected in that designation, and then there's some images there to help visually give some description about what's happening. Next. Table 4 in Chapter 3 is an important table because it describes how the zoning and the future land use map intersect. As identified there with the tan outlines, anything that is an outline in tan is considered an implementing district. That means it is possible, not guaranteed, that that zoning district could be applied within an urban neighborhood designation. Any decision to zone a piece of property still has to be evaluated for the state mandated zoning criteria. And based on that site-specific factual evaluation, a decision to zone one thing versus another is made. Next. So back over to Tom.
And it really starts off. Yeah, yes.
I was going to say you're on mute, but you just caught it.
I think Lacey helped me out. Pardon me. Mentioned earlier, Chapter 4 dives into the implementation for the community plan. And it's really where the rubber hits the road. We've got listed a kind of a short-term action plan. It's really clear and concise statements of what this plan asks the city staff to do to ensure that we have the community that we've all desired. There's some monitoring and updating. So there is, we have a strategic services department here in the city who's responsible for asset management, helping us develop, track, and ensure that we are achieving the goals that are set out in this plan. And there's a series of metrics or indicators listed in this chapter and where we're going to get the data to follow our long-term progress. And this is really kind of a key piece. The City Commission will be diving into this shortly, trying to give us direction on what will be the most important and how we choose to create a hierarchy of actions, because there's quite a bit to do here, and it'll take a period of time to really start implementing and trying to see measurable change and outcomes based on the efforts that we have. Again, Chapter 5, if you ever wondered how you might change the future land designation for your property or a series of properties, this is where that information is. Much of it is influenced and directed by state law, so we have that there. There is a section of how what the criteria of evaluation for zoning changes is. And notably, there is a section where we've got a series of criteria of evaluation, again, for when the city commission may choose to change zoning on a particular property to address some particular deficiency or correct some incongruency between the future land use and the existing zoning on a particular property. There's a lot of content here. It's like all of them, it's a very dense document. So there's really nothing that is more or less important because it all has related together to make this whole document function.
So one of the things we wanted to spend some time talking about in this third of the 3 meetings is how the growth policy actually is applied on the ground and in daily life. Next. Tom showed you this before. This growth policy slide and illustration shows that the growth policy is the broad foundation. It covers a lot of different issues. Some of those issues do directly support the creation of zoning ordinances and amendments. And those amendments in turn support and create the standards for individual site development, whether that's a subdivision or a site plan. Next. Next, please. There we go. So the growth policy, and we have a lot of other plans like Tom showed you on page 9 there, have some here for illustration. Transportation, climate action, community housing action plan, utility plans, all of those set certain aspirations and goals that interact with the growth policy. The growth policy itself and these other plans are not regulatory documents. However, they do influence how the city develops regulations. So the city does amend its regulations as needed to implement the policies. And then once those regulations have been adopted, they do apply to new development applications. A growth policy or these other regulations are not retroactive. They do not go back and apply new standards to existing development. They are looking forward only. And back to Tom.
Thank you, Chris. We really wanted to provide a kind of a visual of what goes into constructing something on the ground, whether it is a vacant parcel, has some existing buildings, or is already completely developed. People may choose to remove those buildings and rebuild, which we would call infill in general, or if it's greenfield, what would go through that. So on the x-axis, going from left to right here about what are the processes that are involved, and then what decisions or what is influenced each stage of the development process. And then most importantly is like where and how does the future land use and community plan come to play. So the image starts out pretty simple and it's going to get way too complicated, but it was difficult to do this without a series of mini slides because every process is different. That's largely dictated by state law, but we follow that. And then we want to make sure that all the aspects of the community's desires are considered during any review of a particular application. So we start off, if somebody has an idea, whether it's building housing, commercial endeavor, or a mixed use building, or anything to that effect, it's how do you get to the point where you can actually start constructing? So the first piece of any of this conversation is, what you have to decide really what the purpose of the building is. What will be the use? And then in addition to that, of course, is if it's heavy industrial versus residential versus commercial that may require a great deal of drive-by traffic for its function and success. Those are really key upfront questions. And that's really where the first piece of the future land use, the community plan, comes into place, because it really indicates where these types of activities ought to occur in the city. And they're dependent on a variety of influences, environmental, transportation, water, sewer, of course, location of the school, the interstate, perhaps even rail service. There's an awful lot that goes into this site selection process. The next piece, and again, I can't stress enough that while I have these in a progression, kind of going left to right in this case, all of these are influenced by each other. One process and even discussion or consideration is not in a vacuum. You may get well down the line and then discover there's something that could really influence the site layout or the viability of the project in whole, and you may have to start back from scratch and finding a new location. But the next is really the process. Is it part of the city already? Does it need annexation? Is there the basic backbones of the development for the water line, sewer line, the sidewalks, pedestrian transportation, vehicular transportation, parks, open space? All of these considerations need to be kind of congeal at this point. Then you actually get to the point where you might have to start preparing a formal application. And at that point, it's really the due diligence of the development community or the property owner to start kind of teasing out, placing all of these bits and parts on this particular property. And we found that at this time, it does seem like most of the simple properties have developed. So what's left are a little more constrained. They're a little more challenging. They take more engineering, more research, more due diligence to make sure that everything, all the parts fit together. At this point is when the application really hits the public notice. Now, I've got some draft plans prepared, some ideas are there. And if the application requires public notice, that's completed. And then the public gets a chance to comment, provide some perhaps direction on what's going on, additional analysis. That's a criteria of evaluation that all applications have to be tested against. And then, of course, a possible decision. Not all applications are approved. Some are approved with conditions, and then some are more simple and may just be approved and they can go on to the last step, which is really the construction phase. Final plans, additional building permits, fire safety issues will be addressed at that point before we get to what we call final occupancy. And the last piece, just to make things a bit more complicated, is the community plan does indicate, suggest, and nudge what the considerations, what the analysis actually is for each of our application processes. So it's the language that's in this document will be teased out and may evolve the zoning standards, the subdivision standards that are contained in the city's development code. So it really does bring it full circle. It's almost circular, so it's continual evolution based on the community's needs and reactionary to what's happening from the development world in the city. So certainly hope that might tease up a couple of questions. Be happy to dive in a little deeper if anybody wishes to. So let's see here. Where am I from this point? I kind of got sucked into this. So the next steps. We pointed this out earlier. We've had these series of workshops, open houses, these meetings, the virtual meetings that we've got going on this evening. Tonight's the third of the series that we've done. We certainly appreciate everybody's attention and participation up to this point. The next steps, again, we'll be bringing this document to the City Commission next Tuesday, October 6th, again on October 20th, and then in November, additional public hearings to possible adoption hearings starting on November 24th. For those that may not know where to get this document, we do host it. We've got physical copies at the library here at the Community Development Department, but hopefully most people will access electronically as a PDF on the city's website. So if you go to Bozeman .net, community plan. It will come up to this website. The upper right, we've got city projects, community plan, and then below that, you can click on the future land use map, the community plan itself, the appendices, and all the supporting documentation behind there. We do encourage, if we're not able to answer your questions this evening, you've taken time to write down some here. We can see some that are spooled up. Please send them along, send them to the commission. We'll respond the best we can in a timely fashion. And the best way to do that is at agenda.bozeman.net for an electronic versus email, or that PO Box 1230, Bozeman, Montana 59771. And thank you all. We certainly appreciate your attention and your attendance. More importantly, thank you for that. Chris and I are here to and dive into any of the questions that you may have. So again, thank you again.
Tom, this is Lacey. We do have a few questions. Let's see. So the first question, Will asks, did you consider fire risk from extending the flume boundaries so close to the forest? Flume boundaries go practically up to forested foothills, south and northeast of town. Wildfire could readily spread to the adjacent high-density urban neighborhoods.
Mike can answer that one. Yes, that is something that we did consider. The city participates with other jurisdictions in developing a hazard mitigation plan for Gallatin County as a whole, and our fire staff and planners are part of that process. We do want to emphasize, as I touched on, the future land use map is identifying if the property is going to change from what it is now, what should it be? So if somebody up along the bench or somewhere else decided that they wanted to keep a property as agricultural property, that's just fine. Plan does not tell them to do anything else. However, if they are going to choose to develop that property, it's the opinion of the city that being able to have municipal services, municipal water, fire service, etc., is going to do a better job being able to protect people's interest in that area than not. And so that we did think about it. You're absolutely right. Fire is a very real thing, as we have just seen this summer, all around as the nation and locally. So we did take that into account, and we're trying to be as careful as we could within the bounds of that. The city does have the ability to establish some regulations relating to fire protection, but there are some things which the state has limited the city's ability to require certain construction methods specific for fire resistant construction and things like that.
Thanks, Chris. The next question is also from Will, and he asks, did you consider wildlife? The agricultural lands south of town have been important winter range for elk herds for many years. Extending high-density urban neighborhoods practically up to the forested foothills will be detrimental to elk populations.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take a shot, Chris, unless you're itching to go.
I'm thinking having the second context map might be useful on the screen there.
Let's see, is that before? There we are. This one?
One more.
Son of a gun, Chris, I'm sorry. Second one.
It is slide 22.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'd forgotten that it actually takes a moment for it to show up on your end. So I had it here and then panicked and took it away.
There we go.
Well, this is a really interesting question. There's an awful lot of pieces to it, and the short answer is yes, we do consider this. What the comment is suggesting and pointing out is the planning area for the city of Bozeman goes approximately 2, even 3 miles outside of our current city limits. And that does bump up this planning area to wildlife corridors, critical wildlife corridors, riparian areas, waterways, water courses. This plan in the city actually has to balance the needs of residents with the demands or the needs for our the wildlife in the area. To be honest, urban development is not necessarily compatible with wildlife corridors. So the city's taken the approach that what's really the best for saving both farmland, wildlife corridors, is developing at a density that we can accommodate many more people than sort of rural subdivision, ranchette, and very low density development. That in itself will go, we think, much further to saving these critical areas than most any other action that the city can do. Our neighbors in Gallatin County, we are of course in Gallatin County, but their actions, which have already occurred, as you can see from this map, there's a great deal of subdivision activity, current development that's already happened in many of these current areas that is simply outside the control of the city. I do need to stress, though, this map is very long term. While the plan, the text is really indicated for 5 or 10 years of utility, this map has been decoupled from the text and will last quite some time. I mean, we anticipate this will take 10, decades and perhaps even never, depending on the science and the data that we have available for our future development. So when we do subdivision review, we do consider impacts on wildlife and wildlife corridors. It's part of state law, and we have to acknowledge that. However, by the time somebody's annexed into the city, we do develop at a density that helps offset the cost of these community services. So it's a balance. I'll stop there. Hopefully that gave you some context of what we look at. And of course, if you have any additional comment, we may have time to dive in.
I guess I just note quickly, like I said before, this is what happens if the property changes. So if, for example, over on the East Bench, there are some existing conservation easements over there. There's some state land that's owned by Montana State University and other agencies. If folks wanted to, emphasize some acquisition of further conservation easements over there and build an area that is protected for wildlife, that's fine. That does not conflict with the plan. The future land use map is looking at what happens if it changes from what it is today. If folks want to preserve what's there today, okay, that can stay there as long as is desired.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, next question, also from Will, and he is asking, by eliminating the suburban residential land use category and replacing with a high density urban neighborhood category, aren't you ensuring that people who actually want to have a real yard will choose to live in suburban subdivisions outside the city?
I can take a first swing at that, and Tom can add to it when I inevitably leave something out. I think one thing that's important to remember in the slide that we had up about implementing zoning districts, there's a wide range of zoning districts. Some of them are high density, some of them are lower density. And there is an opportunity under the city's zoning structure for people to do some mixing and matching. So if there was a desire for somebody to create some half-acre lots in town, there are ways to do that by putting some lower density areas in one part of a development, some more intensive development elsewhere in the same area that equals out and balances the needs. And so we don't think that that's forcing people to the county. However, in the current 2009 plan, the city commission at that time made a conscious decision to say, we are going to be an urban environment. And that means that we are not going to have in-town ranchettes and other kinds of lower density activity, to the point Tom just raised about trade-offs. There are, by making some decisions, we do foreclose some others, but we don't think we're forcing people into non-urban areas unless what they want to do honestly doesn't fit in a city. Tom, what would you like to add?
It's a tough question. And one of the more robust or augmented sections of this community plan or this draft plan is the regional cooperation. And I think that's really what this is getting at. People are still, we live in Montana. There's a very strong private land ethic that you get to do what you want with your land. And if you wish to continue farming, hopefully it's financially viable. But if you choose to develop it in some fashion, you simply have a choice. With the Department of Environmental Quality, they have standards for water and septic systems. And to make our land, we're fortunate. The nexus here, I think, is land is so valuable in Gallatin County that it is almost impossible. Well, I can't say impossible. It's financially difficult to develop at a lower density in the county without a community type of a water and sewer system, which we think will help encourage people develop at higher densities in the city, again, to preserve ag land and viable sizes in the county. But again, the regional coordination is a really big piece here. And it's working with the county commission and the city commission to coordinate these types of issues to maintain our waterways, our ag lands, and use this limited resources of land most efficiently as possible. But it's a great question, and we could speak at it quite some time, but maybe we can move on to the next one. Lacey, thank you.
Okay, Jerry asks, there are many references to greater density and higher intensity development. How will that affect fire danger? Consider also urban forest, quality of life, and affordability, including property values.
Well, I think there's a couple of components to this question. I guess maybe we'll start with fire. We touched on that a little bit earlier. The city does have certain standards that do require provision of street trees and for larger developments to have some additional landscaping included. Those regulations are prepared and overseen as a combination effort between the planning department and the city's forestry department. So we do keep those things in mind. As we've seen, extreme fire behavior can really cover a lot of ground very quickly. And that is true whether or not there is an urban forest. The presence of homes, they can certainly shed sparks and other embers from building to building in very short order. So we believe that the city's fire protection requirements and construction requirements that are in the building code, fire code, and other regulations are generally adequate for typical kinds of events and also some extreme events. Can we guarantee that there will never be a fire that impacts on the city proper? No, we cannot. That's like any other natural disaster, those are things that happen on a scale that are just beyond human control. But we do coordinate with other departments in developing our land use regulations to try and minimize those. Quality of life is a very interesting one because we can find people who will argue that higher density is a greater quality of life and folks that will argue that it lessens their quality of life. Much of that is related to personal values, which is very difficult for the city to incorporate in detail in documents. What we do include from past plans that have moved into regulations are things like ensuring protection of wildlife areas, water courses, wetlands, ensuring parks are put into place, um, working on architectural design standards and other things so that new construction does meet certain expectations of the community as a whole. Um, Density certainly can change the nature of an area, but density is an interesting thing because how do you measure it? Is it people per acre? Is it numbers of cars, height of buildings, square footage of buildings? So depending on who you're speaking with, they can have very different views about what constitutes too much. And so that is an important part of the overall discussion that is bound up in the plan as a whole. And so we hope folks take the time to read the whole thing and think about what they think it means and to communicate with their elected officials who will ultimately make the final decision. As far as affordability, that's another one that's got a lot of ramifications to it. For those who track the national news, housing affordability is a national problem. It ramifications from wage growth or not wage growth, construction costs, lots of different factors fit into that. Basically, what we have seen consistently is a community that is attractive and functional has higher property values than one that is not. The trade-off there is it's great for the people who are here. It's great for the people who have homes, but it can make it more difficult to afford a home if you're trying to move in. The city has tackled some of this with a community housing action plan to address some of the nuances. It certainly won't cover everything, and neither will this document. There are some forces at play that are simply beyond the city's control.
Okay, next question is from Linda. She says, I am struggling to understand the zoning recommendations in the plan. I understand that most of the R zoning categories and one B category are included under urban neighborhoods in the plan. Will there be a combination of R1, R2, and R3 into one category?
If the question is whether the city is going to take the R1, 2, and 3 zoning districts and put them together into a single zoning district, no. The plan does not specifically say that the city should do that. The plan does not say the city should not do that either. The decision to create the number, type, and character of zoning districts is something that's specifically identified as the responsibility of the city commission. They have in the past chosen this particular range of alternatives. They could choose to combine districts, but the plan is not suggesting that they need to do that.
Okay, next question is from Jerry, and he's referencing some goals on page 21 of the plan. And he's asking about goal N is in Nancy 3 and N is in Nancy 3.5. Asks, why can you only discourage covenants?
Because state law says we can't prohibit them. The zoning authorization for municipalities specifically says that folks get to choose if they enter into a covenant. Now, that you cannot use a covenant to violate the zoning. So you can't have a zoning restriction that says height 35 feet and a covenant that says you must build at 300 feet. So we can discourage folks from doing things that we think are going to be contrary to their good and the public good over the long term. But if it's a lawful covenant and they choose to do it, they get to do it, but then they have to enforce it. The city won't do it.
Thanks, Chris. Jerry asks, how many homes can be served by a commercial node? What happens as the surrounding area develops?
There are some different scales of commercial nodes. I'm guessing that the reference is to the smaller ones. We expect that somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 homes is served by or capable of being served by that many. A lot of that has to do with the nature of the businesses that ultimately locate there and the discretionary income that the people have who live in the vicinity. But as the surrounding area develops, the property is shown as a future land use for residential surrounding those areas. So we would expect it to grow and develop as residential. Typically what happens is the commercial uses follow the residential activity rather than lead it. They want the rooftop count nearby. So for example, the Valley West development that's located north of Babcock Street between Cottonwood and Ferguson. They just finished their final plat for the commercial little node that was on the corner of their development. They've been under development for 20 years, and they're just reaching the point that they think that that's a sustainable thing. So it is a long-term look.
Okay, and we have a comment from Steve. He says, we like the zoning of urban neighborhood. The elk migration does not always stay the same. Alluded to a previous question there. And then we've got another question from Linda. She says, can the city participate in conservation easements for wildlife?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know anything that prohibits us from holding such an easement. Usually folks work with somebody like Gallatin Valley Land Trust or one of the other private land trusts for those kinds of things, because that's what they do. They're really good at it. But I don't know anything that prohibits the city from doing so.
All right, I think that concludes our questions.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Looks like we've had 25 people on the call. We appreciate you taking an hour out of your busy days and sharing it with us. We encourage you to offer your comments to the City Commission as this process moves forward.